which changed the rules for the Mac Creek laws and hopefully will help some of the communities up north in those citizens not being punished as they are now. Eric, you want to explain all that to us?
Sure. It's good to be home. And when I mean home, like right next to my house home.
He's practically
Doing the,
there, right?
Running for statewide office, it's like you're everywhere but home and on Lincoln days. But yeah, so we just finished it, as everyone knows, May 15th. It was a crazy last week. And usually that last week, there's a lot going on. You got all these conference committee reports. And, it's a lot of activity. This year was a little different because...
Is it normal that they hold a lot of bills until the very end to use for bargaining chips?
Yeah, oh yeah.
And
Yeah. I try to just, I play it as straight and as quick as I can to try to get to the finish line. But other people have to, and there's probably some merit to the idea of leverage on certain things, but if it's something that I want to get done, like with SB5 in particular, I did not want that to come down to the last week because I knew that there were certain issues that were going to come up in the last week that might unnecessarily impact a really important bill to me, and I think to a lot of people. So, yeah, and we can talk about that if we want to. But SB5, you know, as a St. Louis County, and I actually grew up in North St. Louis County. My grandfather lived in Ferguson many moons ago, but I'm very familiar with the area. Having served in local government here as a lawyer and as somebody that's represented St. Louis County, and actually the only Republican in the Senate that actually resides in St. Louis County now, I felt compelled to address some of the issues that have come to light about municipal courts. And the root causes, I think, of a lot of the injustice that's played out, particularly for the poorest, really, of being ensnared in a system that is mostly about revenue generation for a lot of cities, not all of them. There's a lot of cities that they don't even approach a threshold that you could argue it's civil infractions. I mean, you know, when you have a taillight out on your side before you're going 5 miles over, that's a civil infraction. And as conservatives who care about the Constitution, you're not supposed to be in debtor prisons for those kinds of failure to pay fines. Now, compliance is a very important thing, but what we were seeing were municipal courts that actually were making that more difficult. If somebody wanted to make a half a payment now and a half a payment next month, they were saying, no, we need all the money right now, and if you don't pay by tomorrow, your court date is, there'll be a warrant issue for your arrest. And you know, people were being put in prison without being able to see a judge for long periods of time, and that just does not. That's not what this country is supposed to be about. So what we found was once the data really started to be, you know, revealing itself, I started meeting with folks like, you know, Bill Hennessy, and even some folks on the other side, Lee, some other side, people on the other side of the political spectrum. The ACLU testified alongside with Americans for Prosperity, Arch City Defenders, the Missouri Alliance for Freedom, the St. Louis Tea Party Coalition were all testifying in favor of the same bill. Former Police Chief Tim Fitch, who's seen how this has led to a breakdown of trust between people and their government and their courts. And what we found was all across the state, but probably more acutely here in St. Louis County, and for a variety of reasons, were more and more municipalities becoming more and more reliant on traffic tickets and fines for their budgets. And nothing could be more emblematic of that, in my view, of where my grandma still lives there, is in St. Anne, where you used to have the biggest mall in the country before the Mall of America came around. And just 6 years ago, they wrote about 1,000 tickets and generated about $500,000 worth of revenue. Since that mall has closed, they now write over 9,000 tickets a year and generate about $3.5 million in revenue from traffic tickets and fines. And so you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on. You have a radar gun up in one of the hotels on Highway 70 with 7 part-time police officers vying for, by the way, who writes the most tickets, who gets a full-time position. Just down the road, the city of Edmondson there was uncovered, and Chief Tim Fitch brought this to the hearing, a letter from their mayor to their police chief saying, let me remind you, your production is down for your traffic tickets this month, and your salaries and your raises and your jobs are based on the number of tickets you write. And guess what happened later that month? They wrote more tickets, and they were on track to meet budget. And a lot of municipalities are actually budgeting more from one year to the next on traffic tickets and fines.
Is that what our police is for now, writing tickets?
No, and they're not supposed to be revenue-generating agents. And I will tell you, the rank and file law enforcement people that reached out to me who didn't want to be identified is not why they wanted to be police officers.
Right.
They did not want to write tickets all day long. They believe in community policing. And sure, there are some examples of some abuses, but by and large, this is pressure from kind of the top down that's coming on a lot of the rank and file police officers. And Chief Belmar in St. Louis County is supportive of the bill, as I said, with Tim Fitch, because they know what it's doing to morale. They know what it's doing to that trust between people. And if you, for example, let's say you make $30,000 a year, you're trying to do all the things we want people to do, to go to work, raise their families, and you're going to work and you have a taillight out, and you're on St. Charles Rock Road, and you're spanning 8 municipalities in probably 5 miles. In one of them, the revenue-hungry cities who's got a speed trap out there, you get pulled over and you get cited for that. Well, most municipal court dates are at night. Many of them wouldn't allow kids in the courtroom. 40% of the 81 municipal courts we have in St. Louis County, which by the way is 61 more than any other jurisdiction in the state. Of those 81, 40% of them weren't allowing kids in the courtroom. So people were really making decisions about paying a babysitter and paying the fine. Life happens, maybe they missed that first court date. Well, then a separate charge of failure to appear was put on top of that, which is unnecessary because you can already compel someone's attendance with a warrant for the underlying offense. But it was just another revenue generating tool. So you have a $100 ticket that turns into an $800 ticket. People have to plan for that repair, right? So that first court date they miss, then let's say they're going 7 miles over, or even 11 miles over. Well, at that point now, they have 2 warrants, and if there was a secondary charge of not having their seatbelt on, maybe you have 4 warrants, all of which you have to pay someone to take care of, and the underlying fine. And people were being thrown in jail until they could be seen by a judge, which sometimes lasted more than 72 hours, which is really all the time you're supposed to be held for something like that before they see a judge. And so these instances were just not infrequent instances. I mean, this is something that there's a lot of evidence is happening in a lot of different places. And so that's the kind of momentum. And in St. Louis County alone, there's 14 municipalities where it's their single biggest source of revenue, traffic tickets and fines. And a lot of these cities have had to avoid the very tough priority questions that families have to deal with, that state government has to deal with, about what you want to pay for. But essentially, these city managers were shielding those tough decisions by creating a speed trap in their community. And as I said, it was hurting predominantly African Americans, predominantly poor people in North St. Louis County. There are examples in West County. Clarkson Valley, for example, generated, I think, around 15 or 16% of the revenue from traffic tickets and fines. And at some point, you have to draw a line of what's acceptable. So the current law is 30%, no more than 30%. Now, if you think about that, a third of your budget could be from a speed trap. Now, there's example like Forestell is a great example. They're well over that. There's a lot of cities, half of their revenue. And the existing law didn't really have a lot of mechanisms for enforcement. And so we lowered that threshold to 12.5% here in St. Louis County, 20% for all other counties. For me, I would have loved to have been 10% everywhere. That's how I filed the bill. And as I've said before, I've never voted for a perfect bill. I've filed perfect bills, but I've never voted for a perfect bill. But politics is the art of the possible, and that's just kind of what we had to do to work through a lot of the issues that we had. But in that bill, in addition to lowering that cap, if you don't, you're now required to file an annual statement with the auditor's office with your yearly financial statement, an addendum that deals with what is revenue, how many tickets we've issued. We've very clearly defined those issues now. If you don't remit the excess to the county school fund, so theoretically you could still write as many tickets all day long as if you wanted to, but you just don't get to keep all the money now. It goes to the schools. So if it's about enforcement and if it's about safety, maybe keep doing the same thing, but I'm willing to bet that those numbers will probably come down because that's not what's about a lot of communities. But if they don't remit that excess in 60 days, disincorporation is automatically on the ballot in the next general election. The people will finally get a chance to have that hammer and decide if they think that city's worthy of existing any longer. Tax money can be withheld now. So sales tax revenue that flows through the Department of Revenue and ends up back into the city can be withheld to make sure that there is compliance.
I got a quick question.
Sure.
You said people could vote.
Yeah, on disincorporation.
So what happens then?
So let's say in 2015, well, let's just say 2017, a municipality is out of compliance. And they get notice then, you are 5% over. Please remit that amount in 60 days. If they don't pay up into that county school fund within 60 days, the question will be automatically presented to voters in 2018. The city of Velda Village has been found to be in violation of section yada yada by keeping too much money, traffic tickets and fines. Do you support disincorporating the city of Velda Village? In the same disincorporation, so it takes 60% to disincorporate. We're not changing that. But it's so hard to have those kinds of issues where the people get to decide something.
But then would it revert to a county?
It goes back, it becomes part of unincorporated St. Louis County.
Okay.
Now, there's some remedial measures that could be taken between getting from here to there is maybe 10 municipalities in 3 square miles don't all need a police force. Maybe they could share services. And quite frankly, the layering of taxing jurisdictions in St. Louis County is a true burden for taxpayers. I think that we'll find that services can be as good or better with less of a tax burden on those taxpayers, because they're essentially getting stuck with the bill. And this very hidden tax, which we've done the hashtag taxation by citation, but that's really what this is. It's a very hidden tax on either residents that are going about their business or passersby. In the example of Highway 70 by the airport, welcome to St. Louis County. You get a rent-a-car and then you're being tagged with a ticket. And so one other thing, and I'll just open it up. We also have municipal standards in that bill. And what's interesting about this, law enforcement supported this idea of having your police department accredited within 6 years. You have to have an annual balanced budget. You have to have a cash flow accounting system. All these things that people just assume that a city would do, that many don't do, are now going to be required of those cities to do. And so it's a bill with some significant teeth, and probably the most sweeping municipal reform bill that Missouri's taken on in decades. So I just think it'll make St. Louis County in particular, but the state, a much better place for citizens who are being ensnared in this system. So, but I don't want to talk too long and answer questions.
Are
Yeah,
there
please.
going to be any challenges because of the difference in the tax rate?
The Municipal League has threatened to sue. We are very comfortable.
tonight,
What's that?
the municipal league.
I'm probably not their favorite person in the world right now. But you know what? I didn't get elected to. That's not who I represent. The people who live in those communities are who I represent. And they, for far too long, they've resisted any notion of any kind of change, even incremental. And so this is a long time coming, and they might choose to sue. I think they'll lose, because if you basically, what you'd be saying is that the General Assembly, elected by the people, can't decide that there are issues that are particularly unique or prominent in one particular part of the state versus another part of the state. You'd have to throw out half of our statutes. We have Rock Road, not St. Charles Rock Roads, but Rock Road taxes in some counties and not in other counties. There's laws specific to a city, not within a county. When we do on education bills and we want to address unaccredited school districts, I mean, they're only in a couple places. So that's how the bill's drafted to get it passed. So rural Missouri, they don't want those reforms in their community sometimes, so we draft it towards St. Louis or Kansas City. So we do it all the time. I think it'd be unsuccessful. And actually it'd be in my view, would be incredibly arrogant to spend taxpayer money lobbying against a bill that would benefit taxpayers, and then use because that's what the municipal league does, and then use taxpayer money to sue on a bill that has passed that would benefit taxpayers. But they're going to have to make that decision. I've tried to work with them. I've met with them. I've met with a lot of the mayors in North St. Louis County about this. I think privately they'll admit to you that there's a problem, but I understand what they're saying. I just don't agree with it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, what was the rationale for the difference in rates?
Well, it started out at 10%. When it passed the Senate unanimously, we were at 10% for charter counties, first-class counties, and then smaller rural communities were at 20%. And the issue there was quite frankly, the problems probably weren't as pronounced. Even though the law is named after Max Creek, which is a small rural town, which was a speed trap, it's probably not as pronounced there. The other thing I think that's true, and this is fair to say, that in a lot of those counties that are cities that are more spread out, they don't have as many opportunities for sharing of services that you do in a more densely populated area. And then what we ended up with in the Senate was, or with the House passed a version that was 15% in St. Louis County and 20% everywhere else. And then the compromise position was between 10 and 15, which magically was 12.5% for St. Louis County and 20% for the rest of the state. But that's still, if you would have said 2 years ago that you would have lowered that percentage by a third for the whole state, that would have been a significant reform. But I think the circumstances recently and the issues in St. Louis County in particular led many of us to make sure that we wanted to have the maximum amount of reform. At least I did in my own backyard. Yeah.
Does it cover just, vehicle tickets, or does it include broken sidewalk citations, stuff like that?
It does, and the Post-Dispatch had an article about that in the last couple of days. It deals with moving violations, and we define what moving violations are. That's been the issue that's been really kind of abused, but we'll see. I mean, I think if you see a proliferation of by 800%, some of these other, again, I sat on a board of aldermen in a local government. I understand those issues, but when it becomes not about compliance or, some of those issues, again, on minor civil infractions, and it becomes about generating revenue, I just think it's a problem. And as conservatives, reining in that kind of growth in that bloated nature of government is in our wheelhouse, and which is why I was really proud that we kind of took the lead on this, because it is, and it does affect people's civil liberties too.
Do you think they'll just quit writing tickets when they get close to the limit?
No, I don't think on May 18th they pull all the cops off the street. I think though that the practice of pushing a number and getting, what you saw was whatever that number was, many communities tried to get as close as they could to the 30% or now. I just think that is antithetical to kind of good government. I view this as a good government reform. And look, if circumstances warrant them continuing to write the same number of tickets, the issue is they just don't get to keep all the money. So they can still write all the same tickets. But again, I don't think that's what this really is about. And you look at a lot of the good, well-run cities across the state, and particularly in St. Louis County, they don't need that level of revenue. I mean, we're still talking about essentially 1 out of every $10 in your budget can come from traffic tickets and fines. To me, a community that's doing things the right way, they have other ways of funding. It's sales tax, it's property tax, it's personal. And the issue is this: if you don't have, this is my feeling, if you don't have the guts to go to the voters and ask them, we want to offer you this service and pay for it this way, and let people kind of decide on that, I think you've got bigger problems. And I think that for too long, many of these cities have gotten away with avoiding asking that question. There was an article in the Post, I forget which city it was, is they're having to go to residents and say, well, are you willing to pay for trash service now? I mean, of course you would ask that question if you wanted to provide trash service. But what's happened is they've just been able to do business as usual. And I think this problem has become more acute in the last decade. Quite frankly,
real estate, prices crashing in North County, and commercial values going down and closing up or getting burned down. They had to go somewhere. I'm just looking at it, as an independent, so to say. But they had to go somewhere, so I think they just started writing more tickets, to fund the government.
I think you're exactly right. And look, that's why the St. Anne example, people get that one. It's clear to me because you saw there's a physical mall generating sales tax revenue that's gone. Now you have a physical presence on the highway, and guess what? They're generating almost exactly the same amount of revenue they had.
Well, you got Menards going back.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I hope, and those are the positive things. And Mayor Corcoran, who used to serve in the General Assembly, and again, I'm thankful my grandmother does not have the same last name I do, because she would have a lot of ticketing issues, I think now. But when in talking to him, I think we want to, when they have a win, when they're doing something that's a more typical way, I think we want to applaud them for that. But just setting up a speed trap to meet budget numbers is, I find offensive. Yes?
Do we have some kind of uniform rate for the counties outside St. Louis County? Here it's 20% under the new law, but it was 30% or 40% for some places outside.
Yeah, so it went from 30% to 20% everywhere, except in St. Louis County, it's 12.5%. So we reduced the number by 10% for every other, which was not without controversy in other places too. But I think we built the case well enough to go from 30% to 20% everywhere. But in St. Louis County, where these issues have been highlighted, we went to 12.5%. I wanted to be at 10% for the whole state, but not everybody agreed.
Do you think over time this will have a positive impact on the African American community in North County?
Absolutely. I think
they
that
are the most punished.
I think if you think of the time that police officers are spending on speed traps now, being pushed by their city managers and mayors, as opposed to that additional time they could spend building those relationships within the community, developing trust, so when something happens, people feel comfortable talking to them. That alone, I think, helps with this trust issue. But even larger than that, I think you've got the issue of governance structure that we're tackling, which is important. But if you really want to talk about what this issue is really about, to me, this country was founded on the idea that people had, there was accountability. And the king was not accountable to his subjects, in that there were taxes being laid, and people had no voice. And so we created this form of government where people had a voice. They could engage their leaders. They could make positive change. So when you end up in a situation where courts, law enforcement are being used to generate revenue, people are being viewed as nothing more than ATMs to meet a budget number, well, you really have a breakdown of, to me, what our republic is supposed to be about. And so, not to get too highbrow about it, but there are some fundamental issues of civil liberties, of governance, and how people interact with their local governments that are at stake with this, which is why it was so important to get something done and something meaningful, and not just say we did something to make somebody happy or some agenda. That really wasn't what this is about.
When is this becoming effective?
Well, if the governor signs it, which I expect that he will, August 28th, and so as we go into this next fiscal year, some of these municipalities that have been really the abusers are going to have some very difficult decisions to make, and they're long overdue. Yeah, Lee?
Can we talk about a different topic?
Sure.
Yeah, stay with this. Well, before I go to the other topic, I just want to say, you make it sound as if people are living under some sort of dictatorship in which they have no say, when in fact they've actually abrogated their rights by not seeking decent candidates to be up there, to be the mayor, to appoint these city managers, to appoint the chief of police, and therefore they've just, they've abrogated that, or they don't understand that they have these powers. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, which is on an entirely different subject, is I've been noticing for years, but more now in the last few weeks, a series of TV commercials that are paid for by the taxpayers of the state of Missouri, which feature a particular office holder. I believe his name is Clint Zweifel.
Oh, the currency.
And it's unconscionable that he promotes himself in these commercials. I want to know why that's allowed, and what can be done in law to say that an office holder is not to appear in these commercials, because let's face it,
Well,
the man wants to be something else.
Yeah, well, he actually isn't. He's not running.
Oh, he's not. Okay, well, let's say he did it's a free political commercial.
Yeah, I think the commercials are probably referring to are the 529, the most,
Okay.
the most, the state's 529 college savings plan, right? Those are the commercials you're probably
The
referring
one, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think
It
they're-
would be in that to have that program announced.
Yeah,
to
I
the
mean,
public.
that's probably a better question for Treasurer Zweifel, but I think it's important for people to know that they have a way of saving for college, at what level the awareness, where you draw the line there. I mean, that's, now, he's term limited, and he's not seeking another.
Oh, I understand that it's important that people.
I think what's important is that it's about the policy you're probably trying to promote and that being front and center, so. Yes, sir.
I have been curious about this number of municipalities. When you read the newspaper, we get the impression that the number of school districts in St. Louis County is pretty stable, something like 22 or 23. The police departments in St. Louis County, 71, 72. So the numbers seem to be very fixed for police departments and school districts. But for municipalities, the newspapers never have a number. They say 90 plus, some say 97, 98. Why do we have this variety, and is there such a number?
I think it's 90. There used to be 91, and in the city of St. George actually disincorporated 3 years ago or so and became part of unincorporated St. Louis County. The irony of that, of course, as we're talking about this, is that St. George was an outrageous speed trap, and when the county took it over, Tim Fitch told the story, they were complaining, they contracted with St. Louis County Police Force, they were complaining that St. Louis County wasn't writing enough traffic tickets, but they ended up going out of business, and the people decided, you know what, we'll be fine without it. Now, there are plenty of cities that won't be the case. Do I think we'll have fewer municipalities in 10 years than we do now? Yes.
And maybe fewer police departments?
Yeah, and I think it's important to have accredited police departments. You know, I think if you look at some of the examples that have been through some of the investigative reporting, and again, the professional police officers that I talk to, they know some of those problem departments, and they are supportive of the accreditation process. And so I think those reforms are very meaningful. And look, the truth is that a lot of these police departments and a lot of these municipalities are dealing with issues now that they just simply did not have to deal with 40 years ago. And for a long time, St. Louis County continued to grow. Population was always growing. There were always other issues some other place. But now, with the loss of some of the tax base in certain parts of the county, growth is pretty flat. Some of these issues are being brought to light now a little bit more, and which is why all these issues kind of converge and calling for reform. Yeah, probably got to go up to a little more question. Yes, ma'am.
Do you support Senator Schatz's bill on the pool tax?
I did not.
Okay.
In fact, I worked to hold that up. I
I
don't.
don't know why.
I don't think it's a. So the pool tax is probably one of the most complex and controversial issues if we deal with in St. Louis County. And I understand his perspective. So it basically is you're a point of sale city and you get to keep more if you're a point of sale city if sales tax revenue is generated there. And if you're a pool city, you don't get as much of that point of sale money, but there's some pooling money that all those cities kind of share in. The issue that was brought to light is Chesterfield is developed after the flood and after everybody paid for a levee. The valley has been developed, which is great. And I represent a portion of Chesterfield. I represent a large portion of Wildwood. I also represent cities like Glendale. And a city like Glendale just does not have the ability, and it's not because they're not well run, but we have a heavy incentive, which is why TIF is such an issue in St. Louis County. We have such a heavy incentive on sales tax generation that it has led to some issues. So Chesterfield wants to keep more of the money they generate in their city. My point is, I'd be open to that discussion if there's some way to take into account a resident of Glendale or Oakland or Crestwood or Warson Woods, that they don't get to develop by sheer geography. They don't get to develop a river valley, essentially, that is now protected by a levee, that an interstate goes through, that is a great place to have strip malls and generate a lot of sales tax revenue. if I go shop, I'm shopping in West County or the Galleria or Chesterfield Valley, my purchase is not counted the same because I'm actually physically buying something in Chesterfield. And so my issue with Senator Schatz' bill was that it may be we might be able to have a meaningful discussion about who gets to keep how much, but it is one single part of a huge issue that if we're going to address one thing, I think it needs to be a much broader discussion. Because again, somebody that lives in Glendale, you can't put a big box on that strip of Manchester that's 50 feet deep and to be penalized for that. Now, are there some cities that are making strategic decisions? Yeah, and you don't hear me really defending that. What I'm talking about is the geographical issue of well-run municipalities. Right, the landlocked ones. And so when you look at the cities that would have been impacted by that bill, a lot of them were some that aren't really bad actors. They're people who just live in communities that are veteran communities. One more, yes.
Could you speak a little bit about education, in particular the transfers to charter school bill? In particular, there were 3 exceptions, I think, 3 little districts in Jackson County that were excluded from the expansion of charter schools. How is that rationalized? And finally, what do you think the governor's going to do on that one?
Yeah, that was the other issue that I spent a lot of time on. I was on the conference committee on House Bill 42, and I think that last year we passed a transfer bill that addressed the kind of the easy part of this is allowing the receiving districts so you have unaccredited districts in St. Louis County where students have the right under law to go to any accredited district in that county or in adjoining county. So the first question is, how do the receiving districts get to decide enrollment? How do they get to deal with capacity issues? And we were able to work through that. And last year we did that too. Last year we had a private non-religious option essentially for kids in those unaccredited districts that could be close to home. The governor vetoed that bill. What he said in his veto message and then after that was, okay, it's important to get a bill. I don't want to do the private non-religious, but I'd be very open to charter school, charter school reforms and then virtual school options. And that's exactly what we did. Now, I didn't agree. Senator Holzman from the Kansas City area advocated for 3 of his districts to be carved out of the charter school expansion. I didn't think that was the right policy, but in the sausage making that goes on up there, that ended up in the bill for Jackson County. But St. Louis County was treated as one county, and you had charter school expansion and virtual school options. So the kids, or maybe that traditional setting wasn't working for them, they could have other options. And I think the further we can get along in reform, I mean, we're essentially, and I've talked to this group before about this, our education model in this state and really nationally is still based on when people are planting crops and harvesting crops. I mean, it really makes no particular sense as to why. So our school year is still based on a 19th century agrarian model of how you educate kids so they can be home for farming. And I don't think, in particularly in urban settings, in kids who are in at-risk communities, that worked very well at all. So I had a provision in there that would allow for us, if we chose to fund it, more of a year-round learning, because it's worked. It's worked for a lot of kids in a lot of these tough districts. So, but we ended up with a bill that had virtual and charter school options. I think it's a good bill. It's not, again, there's a lot of things that people can pick out of there that they don't like or they like. I'm hopeful that the governor will sign it. I don't know if he will, though. He's getting a lot of pressure from the school superintendents, particularly the rural superintendents, and that is the most powerful interest group in the General Assembly. There's no doubt about it. And he usually follows their lead. I'm hoping that on this one, where there's so much at stake, and when one of the unaccredited school districts is Normandy, in our effort to try to deal with some underlying systemic issues, that this education bill will pass. Because if it doesn't, you still have the theoretical scenario of receiving districts not being able to say no to 1,000 kids wanting to transfer and having to build new buildings. But even bigger than that, you have kids who are trapped in a district that has been underperforming for a very, very long time. And we got to give those kids better options. So, yes, sir.
There were 2 major bills that were pressed very hard by the state legislators from North St. Louis County, and they used the post-dispatch to splash the message all over. One had to do under what circumstances the police officer
The deadly
fires
force.
his weapon, and the other one,
Body cameras, maybe? Yeah. So,
those bills failed. They also wanted a special prosecutor anytime there was a white officer killing a black person. And I know that there was very little support in the state legislature for these bills. If you read the newspaper here in town, it looked like a very popular measure, but it was not. My question is, how little was that support for these two bills, special prosecutor for a white officer killing a black person?
yeah, so I serve on the Judiciary Committee. That bill never received a hearing if it was in
I
the Judiciary
understand
Committee.
that.
So there was very little support for that, I would say, especially from the chairman. And then the two issues, though, that were probably accurate to say that got some attention were the body camera issue. In the debate that we had there centered really around, which is a legitimate debate to have, what can be accessed? Because technically, those would be, under current law, would be sunshineable, in that if somebody makes a domestic violence call, right, and then a police officer then goes into someone's home, what can a neighbor access? Someone could make a freedom of information request or a news outlet about what somebody's drapes are or what their new coffee table looked like. I mean, if they were just being nosy. So there were a lot of privacy issues that we tried to deal with. The current standard right now is there a reasonable expectation of privacy? When you're on a street, typically where you have a dash cam, you don't have an expectation of privacy. In your home, you have an expectation of privacy. So we dealt with those issues. That bill, though, did not get as far as the deadly force issue. We actually passed the bill out of the Senate. Senator Jamila Nasheed didn't like it. Senator Maria Chappelle-Nadal did, who were the two principal actors pushing for the deadly force measure. The chairman, Bob Dixon, from Springfield, a Republican, actually handled the bill. And really what we dealt with there was an outdated provision in our law, not about when a police officer feels there's an imminent threat. That's not what the issue is really about. It's unconstitutional. The court, in the Garner cases, United States Supreme Court, there has to be a threat or concern that your life or someone's life is in danger. And so the mere act of committing a felony and then a fleeing suspect, can you use deadly force if a felony has been committed and someone's running away? You can't. The Supreme Court says you can't do that. So really we're updating Missouri's law to match where other states are at and what the Supreme Court has said is reasonable force in that situation. It didn't have anything to do with the situation of a police officer, someone running at him, or a gun being pulled. Those are in those circumstances where it's justified. We're not affecting that. It was really the fleeing suspect issue. I would expect, though, that bill, we could probably deal with that issue next year, but that got hung up in this last week of session, and I'll just close with, we did right to work. I supported it, but that kind of ended the session on Tuesday that would normally go to Friday, where something like that we may have been able to work
You
out.
think there's any chance of overriding that?
I don't know. I don't know. The House was 17 votes short. So
But they're already up to 47 short.
that could be. I don't know their caucus as well as ours, and it starts in the House, so they're going to need the 17 votes.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Uh,
Yeah.